Welcome to 18 Jewish Foods, Culture and History in Kosher Bite-Sized Portions. This podcast tells the stories of iconic Jewish dishes, shedding light on the people who eat them. Here's your host, Joel Haber.
Now that I've reached the end of this 20-episode podcast, it's time for me to review and also to look ahead. And if you've not listened to all of the previous 19 episodes, perhaps this finale will encourage you to go back and listen to those that you missed. As with all of my work about Jewish food, I started this podcast back in March as a way of celebrating Jewish culture and history via our foods. Jews are unique as a people due to our specific history and guiding principles. And so I wanted to explore that more deeply by looking at our foods and seeing what was reflected in them. Of course, one obstacle was how one defines Jewish food. Since we've literally spread everywhere on earth over the span of thousands of years and mixed to varying degrees with the cultures that surrounded us, there are few foods that are eaten by Jews everywhere. And it also appears at times like the foods we eat resemble those of our neighbors more than those of Jews in other areas. Therefore, some people argue that Jewish food doesn't exist at all. And I, of course, beg to differ. So, what makes a food Jewish? Many scholars have answered this question in different ways, but as Claudia Roden wrote about Jewish food, because a culture is complex, this does not mean it does not exist. And Jewish culture, and thus its food, is indeed complex. Clearly, a food does not need to be uniquely Jewish or indigenous to our people for it to be considered a Jewish food, any more than those requirements are applied to Japanese food, soul food, or Arabic cuisine. The world of Jewish food is broad and encompasses many things. Still, to make the point, I relied in this podcast on a very strict definition of Jewish foods, things that would be undeniably Jewish. After those, we can then argue about the less obvious choices. And over the course of the past 18 episodes, I explored not just 18 foods that meet those criteria, but many more that fall into the same categories as those 18. In addition to such foods as matzah, the Shabbat stew, pastrami, gondi, kashkarikas, machia, and pizza ibraica, I actually described nearly 100 other such foods. And even still, there were plenty more that I wasn't able to get to, due to the logistics of needing to record a relevant and interesting interview for each title food, and also even more due to the fact that this podcast was by design limited in scope with only 18 episodes, there are a number of other clearly Jewish foods that I didn't get to cover. A couple of examples of foods that could have had their own episodes are sabich, pekela, and the falafel sandwich, which, yes, could meet the criteria of being a Jewish food. Maybe I will address those in the future. But more importantly, I didn't simply create this podcast to argue for the existence of Jewish foods in general. As I mentioned, that's a non-starter argument and a silly thing to be discussing. I set out to do something bigger, to celebrate, as I said, the uniqueness of the Jewish people. One aspect of what makes Jews different and special is our diversity. Since we are the most globalized nation in the world, I aimed as much as possible to highlight foods from Jewish communities worldwide. I even dedicated one full episode, the one that was focused on Malida, to specifically exploring the lesser known or smaller Jewish groups, such as those from places like India, Suriname, and Dagestan. But I also looked at foods from such places as Italy, Turkey, Iran, Holland, Spain, Russia, Alsace, Morocco, and, of course, the US, and Israel. But even still, there remain some countries and communities that I didn't get to cover, even in passing, such as Bukharian Jews of Central Asia, Scandinavian Jews, Bulgarian Jews, and the Jews of most of Latin America. While I did focus on that diversity, I also had 3 episodes that all focused primarily on American Jewish foods. And while each one of those did highlight a slightly different aspect of American Jewish society, still, that's a lot to have from one single country. To a certain degree, this reflects my particular upbringing and the source of much of this podcast's listenership base. But it's also a recognition of the fact that American Jewry is the dominant community in world Jewry today, both numerically and culturally. The other dominant Jewish culture today is where I currently make my home, in Israel. And while I did have one episode that specifically focused on Israeli food, and while I also mentioned some other Israeli foods as secondary dishes in different episodes, I would have loved to have focused some more attention on that community as well. Most importantly, the foods that I selected to discuss were not only designed to reflect our people's diversity, they also were designed to show many of our unique cultural aspects. For example, Jewish values such as Bal Tashchit. We value God's gifts to humanity, and therefore we avoid wasting usable things. We saw the different ways in which Jews use food to honor the Sabbath and our special holidays. Some of those foods, such as matzah, tie directly into our holy books, while others, such as kugel, connect more with some of the esoteric ideas found in Kabbalah and Hasidism. Other foods highlighted our focus on symbolism and the meaning that exists in the world around us. But beyond the Jewish people's cultural differences, our history has also set us apart from other nations. With the unity that ties us together within the diversity that I already discussed, we have remained connected to each other while being separated physically. Therefore, we transported foods around the world and affected foods in other Jewish communities. But even more so, we affected some of the foods of non-Jews around us. All of this I looked at in various episodes as well. And in our food, we even can see the results of some of the negative aspects of our history, such as anti-Semitism. In fact, Jewish food has been one of the great tools by which we have persevered and overcome such hardships. Now, I should say that a number of these topics are things that I've explored in much greater depth in the lectures that I present around the world. So far, I've spoken to over 1,000 people in 7 different countries across 4 continents, and I travel 2 to 3 times a year on lecture tours. So, if you like what you've heard on this podcast and are interested in having me come to speak to your community, please reach out to me via email. My address is jewishfoodbook@gmail.com. My next trips planned will be to England in just a few weeks and to North America in late February, early March. And really, I'd love to speak anywhere that people want to have me come to. So with that, what is next for me in podcasting now that this one has reached its conclusion? I've enjoyed making this podcast and have received good feedback from you, my listeners, on what I've done with it so far. So I would definitely like to do more. I have a few ideas that have been percolating in my head, but I've not yet finalized the exact details or format yet. However, in part, I hope to focus on answering the questions that people have about Jewish food. I get asked questions all the time, and I'm sure many of you have some of those questions. So if you have questions about Jewish food that have made you curious, please email me and let me know. I'll answer you via email, at least in brief, and then we'll hopefully expand on my response in a future podcast. Furthermore, while I develop that next podcast idea more clearly, I'm probably going to release a mini bonus season of 18 Jewish Foods between now and when that one launches. I will not be doing 18 more episodes. This will not be 18 more Jewish foods, but I might do a few fresh episodes to cover some of the topics I mentioned above that deserved more coverage. And also, since all of the interviews that I included were edited down from significantly longer recordings, I may have some episodes in that bonus season that feature excerpts that ended up on the proverbial cutting room floor. Finally, I want to thank all of my interview guests one more time. In sequence, they were Jennifer Abadi, Ruti Russo, Susan Weingarten, the Sephardic Spice Girls, Chani Apfelbaum, Tanaz Sassouni, Joe Corson, Sibel Pinto, Ted Merwin, Benedetta Guetta, Hélène Jawara Pinier, Adina Sussman, David and Dorit Namias, Jeffrey Yaskowitz, Shuli Madnick, Hasia Diner, Henri Lipman, and Andrew Coe. Thank you all. You added so much depth, character, and insight that made this podcast way more than it would have been otherwise. So I thank you for your passion. Thanks as well to Marcy Height for her voiceover work and to Rebbe Soul for the use of his music. And most importantly, thank you all for listening. I hope you'll be back for the 18 Jewish Foods bonus season and also for the next podcast I create afterwards. Until then, I wish you all an early Happy Hanukkah and B'tei Avon.
Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed. Got any questions or comments? Please feel free to email me at jewishfoodbook@gmail.com. Please listen, like, and follow wherever you get your podcasts, and I would truly appreciate it if you'd share this with other Jewish food lovers. The theme music you hear is Adir Hu Revisited by Rebbe Soul. Check him out wherever you stream music. And as always, until next time, I wish you B'tei Avon.